The morning sun painted golden streaks across the pristine walls of Westbrook Academy as a black SUV pulled into the student drop-off zone. Inside, 15-year-old David Carter adjusted his backpack, taking a deep breath. His first day at one of the most prestigious schools in the state. His father, sitting beside him, gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Remember what we talked about, son. Stay humble, work hard, and let your actions speak for themselves," his father said warmly. David nodded, stepping out of the car. His designer uniform was perfectly pressed, and his leather shoes gleamed, but he carried himself with a quiet simplicity that made him blend in despite the expensive details. As the SUV drove away, David walked toward the main entrance, unaware that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. Mrs. Thompson, a veteran English teacher with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses, stood at her classroom door greeting students. She had taught at Westbrook for over 20 years and took pride in maintaining what she called high standards in her classroom. When David approached with his transfer papers, her expression shifted slightly. "New student?" she asked, scanning the document with raised eyebrows. "Mid-semester transfer. That's unusual for Westbrook." David smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. We just moved here from Chicago." Mrs. Thompson's eyes traveled from his face to his expensive accessories, then back to his face. "I see. And how exactly does your family afford Westbrook's tuition? We don't usually have students from certain backgrounds unless they're on scholarship." The classroom fell silent. Several students looked up from their morning preparations, sensing the tension. David felt his cheeks warm but maintained his composure. "My father works in technology," he replied simply, remembering his dad's advice to never flaunt their wealth. Mrs. Thompson let out a small laugh. "Technology? Well, I suppose someone has to fix the computers around here." She gestured toward the back of the room. "Take that seat in the corner. I like to keep scholarship students where I can. Keep an eye on them." David walked to the assigned seat, feeling the weight of curious stares. A few students offered sympathetic glances, while others whispered behind their hands. He set his backpack down and pulled out his notebook, determined not to let the uncomfortable start affect his focus. Throughout the morning lesson, Mrs. Thompson repeatedly skipped over David when he raised his hand to answer questions. When she finally did call on him, his correct answer about Shakespeare's sonnets was met with a surprised, "Well, I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day." During lunch, David sat alone in the cafeteria, observing the social dynamics of his new school. A few students approached tentatively but backed away when they noticed Mrs. Thompson watching from the faculty table. Word had already spread about the morning's incident. In the afternoon, Mrs. Thompson assigned a pop quiz on the current reading material. David finished quickly, his private tutoring in Chicago having covered similar content. When papers were collected, Mrs. Thompson made a show of examining his work. "Interesting that you finished so fast," she commented loudly. "I hope you're not bringing any bad habits from your previous school." The final bell couldn't come soon enough. As David packed his belongings, he overheard Mrs. Thompson talking to another teacher in the hallway. "You should have seen the nerve of this new student," she was saying. "Designer everything, probably fake. These people always find ways to get into places they don't belong. Mark my words, he won't last a month here." David stepped out of the classroom, shoulders straight but heart heavy. His father's car was waiting in the pickup line, and for the first time that day, David allowed himself to relax. As he climbed into the back seat, his father turned with a knowing smile. "Rough first day?" he asked gently. David nodded, unsure how much to share. His father, Robert Carter, the founder and CEO of the largest tech company in the state, had warned him that some people might treat him differently. But David had never imagined it would be because of assumptions about his race, not his family's wealth. "Tell me about it on the way home," his father said. "Remember, son, how people treat you says more about them than it does about you." As they drove away from Westbrook Academy, David wondered what the coming weeks would bring. He had no idea that his quiet endurance would soon lead to a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the prestigious institution. The weeks that followed David's arrival at Westbrook Academy brought a pattern of behavior from Mrs. Thompson that became impossible to ignore. Each morning, David would enter the classroom with hope that things might be different, only to face new challenges to his dignity. In the third week, Mrs. Thompson announced a major essay assignment on American literature. David spent hours crafting his paper, drawing from his extensive reading and the excellent education he'd received at his previous school. When the graded papers were returned, David's heart sank as he saw the large red C scrawled across the top. "Some of you clearly put more effort into this than others," Mrs. Thompson announced, holding up a paper. "Take Jessica's work, for example. This is what dedication looks like." She then turned to David. "And some of you might want to consider whether advanced English is really the right fit." David approached her desk after class, his essay in hand. "Mrs. Thompson, could you help me understand where I went wrong? I'd like to improve." She barely glanced at him. "The writing just lacks authenticity. It feels like you're trying too hard to sound educated." The words stung, but David maintained his composure. That afternoon, during study hall, a classmate named Rachel quietly slid into the seat next to David. "I read your essay when Mrs. Thompson stepped out," she whispered. "It was better than mine, and I got an A. This isn't right." More students began to notice the unfair treatment. When David raised his hand to answer questions, Mrs. Thompson would pretend not to see him. When forced to call on him and he gave correct answers, she'd find ways to diminish his contributions. "That's technically correct, I suppose," she'd say, her tone suggesting surprise that he could know anything at all. The breaking point came during a pop quiz on Shakespeare. David finished first, as usual, and Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed as she collected his paper. The next day, she stood at the front of the class with a grave expression. "It seems we have an issue of academic dishonesty," she announced, holding up David's quiz. "This paper shows a suspicious level of knowledge. David, would you care to explain how you knew these obscure details about Hamlet?" David's face burned as 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "I've studied Shakespeare extensively. My previous school in Chicago had an advanced literature program." "How convenient," Mrs. Thompson replied with a cold smile. "And I suppose you just happened to memorize the exact passages I selected." "Mrs. Thompson," a voice interrupted. It was Michael, the class valedictorian. "I saw David's books during lunch. He has annotated copies of all of Shakespeare's plays. He's clearly done the work." Mrs. Thompson's face hardened. "I don't recall asking for your input, Michael. Now, David, you'll retake this quiz after school under my supervision, unless you have something to hide." That evening, David sat alone in the empty classroom, retaking the quiz while Mrs. Thompson watched him like a hawk. He answered every question perfectly, his hand steady despite the humiliation. When he finished, Mrs. Thompson grudgingly marked it with the same perfect score. "I suppose even unlikely students can occasionally surprise us," she muttered, adding, "though I'll be watching more carefully from now on." Word of the incident spread quickly through the school. In the cafeteria the next day, several students approached David. "She's been like this for years," one student confided, "but never this obvious. It's like she's targeting you specifically." "My parents wanted to complain last year," another added, "but she has tenure. The administration won't do anything unless there's undeniable proof." David listened quietly, grateful for the support but unsure how to proceed. He hadn't told his father the full extent of what was happening, not wanting to worry him or use their family's influence to solve his problems. As the weeks wore on, Mrs. Thompson's behavior became more brazen. She moved David's seat even further back, claiming she needed to accommodate students who were struggling to see the board. She lost his homework assignments, forcing him to redo them. She made cutting remarks about people who don't belong in advanced classes while looking directly at him. Despite everything, David's grades remained strong in all his other classes. His math teacher praised his analytical skills. His science teacher recommended him for the honors program. His history teacher called him one of the most insightful students she'd ever taught. But in English class, David felt the weight of prejudice pressing down on him daily. He began to dread fourth period, knowing that no matter how hard he worked or how well he performed, Mrs. Thompson would find a way to belittle his efforts. What David didn't know was that other teachers had started to notice. Quiet conversations were happening in the faculty lounge. Documentation was being gathered, and soon, very soon, everything would come to light in a way no one expected. As October arrived at Westbrook Academy, colorful banners announced the upcoming Parent-Teacher Conference Week. The hallways buzzed with students discussing which parents would attend and teachers preparing their progress reports. For David, this week brought a mix of anticipation and dread. Mrs. Thompson had been reviewing student files in preparation for the meetings. When she reached David's folder, her eyes lingered on the emergency contact information. Listed clearly was RC Enterprises with a phone number. She scoffed, pushing the folder aside. RC Enterprises, she muttered to herself. Probably where his father works in maintenance or security. These people always exaggerate their positions. During class that day, Mrs. Thompson assigned a challenging essay on the impact of technology on modern society. This topic requires a sophisticated understanding of both literature and current affairs, she announced, her gaze settling on David. Some of you might find it particularly challenging. David spent the weekend crafting his essay, drawing from his unique perspective as the son of a tech innovator. He wrote about digital inequality, the democratization of information, and the responsibility of tech companies to serve all communities. His passion for the subject flowed through every paragraph. Monday morning, David submitted his essay with quiet confidence. By Wednesday, the graded papers were returned. Mrs. Thompson saved David's for last, holding it up for the entire class to see. "Class, I want to discuss a serious matter," she began, her voice dripping with false concern. Academic integrity is the cornerstone of education. When a student submits work that is clearly beyond their capabilities, it raises red flags. David's stomach churned as she continued. "This essay contains concepts and vocabulary that I find highly suspicious. The discussion of algorithmic bias, digital infrastructure, and technological equity. These are graduate-level concepts." She turned to David, her eyes cold. "Care to explain where you really got this information? Which website did you copy it from?" David's hands clenched under his desk. "I wrote every word myself, Mrs. Thompson. My father works in technology. We discussed these topics at home." "Your father works in technology?" She laughed mockingly. "Cleaning computers doesn't make someone a tech expert. This is clearly plagiarized. You'll receive a 0, and I'll be reporting this to the administration." The classroom was dead silent. Rachel, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned around with wide eyes. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Other students exchanged glances of disbelief. "Mrs. Thompson," David said, standing up slowly, his voice steady despite his anger, "you've questioned my integrity, my intelligence, and my place in the school since day one. I've remained respectful, but this accusation is unfair and unfounded." "Sit down," Mrs. Thompson snapped. "Your attitude only confirms my suspicions. In my 23 years of teaching, I've seen all kinds of cheating, but this is bold even by those standards." At lunch, the cafeteria was abuzz with whispers about the incident. David sat with Michael and Rachel, who had become his closest allies. "She's gone too far this time," Michael said. "We need to do something." Rachel nodded. "My mom's a lawyer. She says what Mrs. Thompson's doing could be considered discrimination." David shook his head. "I don't want to cause trouble. My father always says to handle things with dignity." "But this isn't about causing trouble," Rachel insisted. "It's about standing up for what's right." That afternoon, during her free period, Mrs. Thompson called the attendance office. "I need to verify some information about David Carter's emergency contact," she said. "This RC Enterprises listing, is that accurate?" The secretary pulled up the file. "Yes, that's correct. RC Enterprises is the parent company. The specific contact is listed as Robert Carter, CEO." Mrs. Thompson laughed. "CEO? Please. These parents and their inflated titles. He probably runs a small cleaning service and calls himself CEO. Thank you for confirming." Meanwhile, in his other classes, David continued to excel. His physics teacher pulled him aside after class. "David, I've heard about what's happening in English. We're documenting everything. Please know that many of us see your potential and value your presence here." That evening, David finally opened up to his father about the full extent of Mrs. Thompson's behavior. Robert Carter listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Son," he said finally, "I've let you handle this on your own because I believe in your strength. But there's a difference between being strong and allowing injustice to continue. The parent-teacher conference is next week. I think it's time I met Mrs. Thompson." David nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "Dad, I don't want special treatment because of who you are." Robert smiled. "This isn't about special treatment. It's about ensuring every student at that school receives the respect they deserve. Sometimes, son, changing systems requires revealing truth." Neither of them could have predicted how dramatically that truth would soon emerge. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers as preparations for the school's annual fundraising gala reached their final stages. This wasn't just any event, it was the highlight of Westbrook Academy's social calendar, where the state's most influential families gathered to support the school. Mrs. Thompson walked through her classroom that Friday morning with an extra spring in her step. The gala was tomorrow night, and she loved these events where she could network with the right kind of families. "Don't forget," she announced to her class, "the gala is tomorrow evening. I expect to see many of your parents there. It's always wonderful to meet the families who truly invest in their children's education." Her eyes landed on David, who was quietly reading at his desk. Of course, not everyone's parents can attend these events. They are rather exclusive. David looked up but said nothing. Rachel caught his eye and shook her head in disgust at Mrs. Thompson's comment. At lunch, the conversation centered around the gala. Students discussed what their parents would wear, who would bid on which auction items, and the rumored special announcement. "I heard they're announcing the biggest donation in school history," Michael said excitedly. "Someone's funding a whole new building." "My mom said the donor is some tech billionaire," Rachel added. "But they're keeping the identity secret until tomorrow night." David listened quietly, a small smile playing on his lips. When Rachel asked if his parents were coming, he simply nodded and said, "My father will be there." Mrs. Thompson overheard this exchange while monitoring the cafeteria. She smirked and whispered to another teacher, "I doubt that very much. These tickets cost more than his family probably makes in a month." Saturday evening arrived with perfect autumn weather. The Westbrook Hotel's entrance was lined with luxury cars as elegantly dressed guests made their way inside. Mrs. Thompson stood near the registration table, greeting parents with practiced charm. The school principal, Dr. Reynolds, took the stage as dinner concluded. The room hushed as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we make history. Westbrook Academy has received the largest single donation in our 75-year existence, $5 million for a new science and technology center." Gasps and applause filled the room. Mrs. Thompson straightened in her chair, eager to see which prominent family had made such a generous gift. "It is my profound honor," Dr. Reynolds continued, "to introduce our keynote speaker and benefactor, the CEO of RC Enterprises, the largest technology company in our state, Mr. Robert Carter." The ballroom doors opened and a tall, distinguished man in an impeccably tailored suit walked in. Mrs. Thompson's polite smile began to fade as she noticed something familiar about him. As Robert Carter made his way to the stage, he paused at a table near the front. Mrs. Thompson watched in growing confusion as he leaned down to embrace David. "That's my dad," David said quietly to Michael, who was seated beside him. Mrs. Thompson felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as the reality crashed over her. RC Enterprises, Robert Carter, David Carter. On stage, Robert Carter began his speech. "Technology has the power to transform lives, but only if we ensure equal access and opportunity for all students, regardless of their background." Mrs. Thompson's mind raced. Every dismissive comment, every unfounded accusation, every moment she tried to make David feel small, they all flashed before her eyes. During the speech, several teachers approached David's table to congratulate him. Mrs. Thompson remained frozen in her seat, unable to move. As the evening progressed, the principal brought various school officials to meet Mr. Carter. When they finally reached Mrs. Thompson's table, she stood on shaky legs. "Mr. Carter," Dr. Reynolds said warmly, "this is Mrs. Thompson, one of our English teachers. I believe she has the pleasure of teaching your son." Robert Carter's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes held a knowing look. Mrs. Thompson, David has told me so much about your class." Mrs. Thompson's mouth opened, but no words came out. She felt the weight of every prejudiced assumption she'd made crashing down on her. "Actually," Robert continued, his voice still calm, I was hoping to discuss David's experience in your class. He showed me an essay you recently graded, something about technology and society. I found your feedback interesting. Around them, other teachers exchanged meaningful glances. Some who had witnessed Mrs. Thompson's behavior nodded slightly as if pieces were falling into place. As the band began to play and guests moved toward the dance floor, Mrs. Thompson stood there, her world tilting on its axis. The scholarship student she belittled, the maintenance worker's son she dismissed, was actually the heir to the largest fortune in the state. The evening was far from over, and the real confrontation was yet to come. The gala continued with elegant music filling the ballroom, but Mrs. Thompson felt like she was moving through a nightmare. She watched as Robert Carter gracefully made his way through the crowd, stopping to chat with various guests, his son David beside him with quiet dignity. Dr. Reynolds appeared at Robert's side. "Mr. Carter, several of our board members are eager to meet you. But first, perhaps you'd like to visit with some of David's teachers." "That would be wonderful," Robert replied, his voice warm but purposeful. As they approached the faculty table, several teachers stood to greet them. Mr. Harrison, the physics teacher, shook Robert's hand enthusiastically. "David is exceptional in my class. His understanding of complex concepts is remarkable." Mrs. Chen, the math teacher, nodded in agreement. "He's one of my top students, always helping others, never showing off despite his abilities." Mrs. Thompson remained silent, hoping to blend into the background. But Robert's gaze found her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said cordially, "I understand you've been David's English teacher these past months." She swallowed hard. "Yes, he's been in my class." "David tells me you recently accused him of plagiarism," Robert continued, his tone still pleasant but his eyes sharp. "Something about an essay on technology being too advanced for his capabilities." The other teachers shifted uncomfortably. They had heard about the incident but hadn't realized it would come up tonight. "There was a misunderstanding," Mrs. Thompson stammered. "The quality seemed unusually high." "Unusually high for whom?" Robert asked quietly. Dr. Reynolds, sensing the tension, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No," Robert said firmly but calmly. "I think this is exactly the right moment. You see, Dr. Reynolds, my son has been facing systematic discrimination in Mrs. Thompson's class. Not just the plagiarism accusation, but constant belittling, unfair grading, and yes, assumptions based on his race." The surrounding conversations died down as people began to notice the serious discussion taking place. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed red. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you." "Can you?" Robert interrupted gently. "Can you assure me that you didn't assume David was on scholarship the moment you saw him? That you didn't seat him in the back of the class? That you didn't suggest he didn't belong at Westbrook?" Other teachers began to speak up. Ms. Rodriguez from the science department stepped forward. "I've noticed the discrepancy in David's grades, as in all subjects except English." Mr. Peters, the history teacher, added, "David mentioned feeling unwelcome in your class, Mrs. Thompson. I thought he was being sensitive, but now." Students and parents at nearby tables were listening intently. Rachel's parents moved closer, having heard their daughter's concerns about David's treatment. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. "I've documented everything, Dr. Reynolds. The essay with the unjustified low grade, the seating arrangement, witnesses to various incidents." He turned to Mrs. Thompson. "You assumed my son didn't belong here because of his skin color. You never bothered to know him, to understand his capabilities, or to treat him with the respect every student deserves." Mrs. Thompson's attempts at defense crumbled. I had no idea who you were." "And that's precisely the problem," Robert replied. "My son's worth shouldn't depend on who his father is. Every child in your classroom deserves equal treatment, regardless of their parents' bank accounts or positions." Dr. Reynolds looked mortified. "Mr. Carter, I assure you we will investigate this thoroughly." "I hope so," Robert said, "because my donation comes with conditions. This school needs to examine its practices not just in Mrs. Thompson's classroom, but throughout the institution. How many other students have faced similar prejudice?" Board members had now gathered, listening intently. The chairman stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, we take these allegations very seriously. We'll launch a full investigation immediately." David, who had been standing quietly beside his father, finally spoke. "I didn't want to use our family name to get special treatment. I just wanted to be treated fairly." His words resonated through the room. Several parents approached, expressing support and sharing their own children's experiences with subtle discrimination at the school. Mrs. Thompson stood isolated, her world of assumptions shattered. The maintenance worker's son she had dismissed was actually the heir to an empire, but more importantly, he was a brilliant student she had failed to recognize because of her prejudices. As the evening progressed, it became clear that this girl would be remembered not just for the generous donation, but for the moment when uncomfortable truths about Westbrook Academy came to light. The reverberations of this night would change the school forever. Monday morning arrived with an unusual tension at Westbrook Academy. News of Saturday's gala had spread like wildfire through text messages and parent networks. Everyone knew something significant had happened involving Mrs. Thompson and the Carter family. Dr. Reynolds called an emergency board meeting at 7 a.m. The conference room filled with serious faces as Robert Carter joined them via video call, his calm demeanor contrasting with the nervous energy in the room. "Mr. Carter," the board chairman began, "we've reviewed the documentation you provided. It's troubling, to say the least." Robert nodded. "This isn't just about my son. It's about creating an environment where every student feels valued. What happened to David could be happening to others." Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson sat in her empty classroom, arriving early to avoid the whispers in the hallways. Her phone buzzed with a message to report to the principal's office immediately. As she walked through the corridors, she noticed how conversations stopped when she passed. Teachers who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. The weight of her actions pressed down with each step. In Dr. Reynolds' office, she found herself facing not just the principal, but also the school board's legal counsel and the head of human resources. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Reynolds began, his voice firm, "we need to discuss the serious allegations regarding your treatment of David Carter." For the first time, Mrs. Thompson's defenses crumbled completely. I never meant to. I didn't realize." "That's precisely the problem," the legal counsel interrupted. "Your unconscious bias led to conscious actions that harmed a student. We have testimonies from other teachers, students who witnessed the incidents, and David's own detailed account." The HR director slid a document across the desk. "Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. You'll need to attend mandatory diversity and inclusion training." Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she read the paper. 23 years I've taught here. And in those years, how many other students faced similar treatment?" Dr. Reynolds asked pointedly. "We're reviewing all your grade records and student interactions." Back in the video call, Robert addressed the board. "I want to be clear. My goal isn't to destroy anyone's career, but to ensure this never happens again. The new Technology Center will include a program specifically focused on diversity in STEM fields." "What about David?" a board member asked. "Will he continue at Westbrook?" Robert smiled slightly. "That's his decision. But he wants to stay and be part of the change." Later that morning, Dr. Reynolds addressed the student body in a special assembly. David sat between Rachel and Michael, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. "Westbrook Academy has always prided itself on excellence," Dr. Reynolds announced. "But we've failed in a fundamental way. We've allowed prejudice to exist in our classrooms. This ends now." He outlined new policies, mandatory bias training for all staff, a diversity committee with student representation, and a review system for grading disparities. The Technology Center would include scholarships for underprivileged students of all backgrounds. After the assembly, David was surrounded by classmates offering support. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others shared their own experiences with subtle discrimination. Mrs. Thompson returned to her classroom one last time to collect her belongings. As she packed her books, she found David standing in the doorway. "David," she began, her voice breaking, "I owe you an apology." "A real one." David stepped inside. "Mrs. Thompson, I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted to learn." "I know," she whispered. "I let my assumptions blind me to who you really are. I've been teaching for over 2 decades, but I forgot the most important lesson, to see each student as an individual." "People can change," David offered quietly. That's what education is supposed to be about, isn't it? His grace in that moment affected Mrs. Thompson more than any reprimand could have. She realized the true measure of the young man she had so wrongly judged. That afternoon, the local news picked up the story. Tech billionaire's son faces discrimination at elite school, read the headlines. But Robert Carter declined interviews, stating, "This isn't about publicity, it's about making real change in education." As David walked to his father's car after school, he felt something shift in the air at Westbrook. Students nodded with newfound respect. Teachers offered genuine smiles. The wall of prejudice had cracked, and through that crack, light was beginning to shine. The investigation was just beginning, but change was already taking root. Sometimes it takes a moment of truth to transform an institution, and Westbrook Academy would never be the same. 6 months had passed since the night that changed Westbrook Academy forever. The spring sun warmed the campus as construction crews worked on the new Carter Technology Center, its modern glass walls rising beside the traditional brick buildings. David walked through the hallways with a different energy now. He led the newly formed Student Diversity Council, working alongside faculty to ensure every voice was heard. The council had already implemented changes that rippled through the entire school culture. In a small office across town, Mrs. Thompson sat in her final diversity training session. The months of workshops, self-reflection, and counseling had been transformative. She had written personal apology letters to David and other students she now realized she had treated unfairly over the years. "Elizabeth," her counselor said, using her first name, "you've made remarkable progress. Are you ready for your meeting with the school board?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, clutching a folder containing her letter of resignation and a proposal for a new program she hoped to establish. That afternoon, she entered the Westbrook conference room, where she had once sat in judgment of students. Now she faced the board, Dr. Reynolds, and surprisingly, Robert Carter himself. "I've come to formally resign," she began, her voice steady. "But I also want to propose something. I'd like to use my experience to help other educators recognize and overcome their biases." Robert leaned forward, interested. "Go on." "I've developed a workshop program called Breaking the Bias Barrier. It uses my story as a cautionary tale and provides practical tools for teachers to examine their own prejudices." The board members exchanged glances. Dr. Reynolds spoke first. "Mrs. Thompson, your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and transform them into something positive is commendable." Robert nodded. "I believe in second chances when they're earned through genuine change. I'd be willing to fund a pilot program, but it would need oversight from our diversity committee." Meanwhile, at Westbrook, David was preparing for a special presentation. The Technology Center was nearly complete, and he had been chosen to speak at its dedication ceremony. As he reviewed his notes in the library, Rachel and Michael joined him. "Nervous?" Rachel asked. David smiled. "A little, but this feels important. It's not just about what happened to me anymore." The dedication ceremony drew a large crowd. Local media, education leaders, and the entire Westbrook community gathered as the ribbon was cut on the Carter Technology Center. Inside, state-of-the-art equipment awaited students from all backgrounds, with special programs designed to bridge the digital divide. David took the podium, his father beaming proudly from the front row. "When I first came to Westbrook, I experienced what many students of color face daily, assumptions about who we are and what we can achieve. But today, we're not just opening a building, we're opening minds." He continued, "Mrs. Thompson, my former English teacher, is here today. She taught me something valuable, though not in the way she intended. She taught me that change is possible when we confront our biases honestly." In the audience, Mrs. Thompson wiped away tears. The journey from that day of humiliation to this moment of hope had been long and difficult, but necessary. The Technology Center became more than just a building. It housed the David Carter Scholarship Fund, providing opportunities for underprivileged students of all backgrounds. The Breaking the Bias Barrier program, led by a reformed Mrs. Thompson, became a model for schools across the state. At graduation that spring, David stood as valedictorian. His speech moved many to tears as he spoke about the power of forgiveness, the importance of standing up for justice, and the responsibility that comes with privilege. "We all have biases," he said, looking out at his classmates. "The question is what we do when we recognize them." Do we defend them or defeat them? Do we let them define us or do we rise above them? As David received his diploma, he shook hands with Dr. Reynolds and the board members. Mrs. Thompson, invited back for the ceremony, approached him afterward. "David," she said, "you've taught this school, and me, more than any textbook ever could. Thank you for your grace." David smiled. "We're all teachers and students in life, Mrs. Thompson. The important thing is that we keep learning." As the sun set on Westbrook Academy that day, it illuminated a school transformed. Where prejudice once lurked in shadows, understanding now flourished in the light. The Carter Technology Center stood as a monument not just to wealth or technology, but to the power of confronting injustice with dignity and creating change through compassion. David's journey from discriminated student to catalyst for change proved that sometimes the greatest lessons come from our greatest challenges, and sometimes a single voice speaking truth can echo through generations.